Good morning, everyone. Can you all hear me? Have you all had your caffeine? Yeah, breakfast, raring to go? Excellent. Well, so I'm Sarah Brockless, and this is Jamie Dixon. We work at Spain's Hall Estate at Finchingfield in Essex, and we're here today to talk to you a little bit about how we're setting up an agroforestry nut system alongside landscape scale biodiversity. So for those that don't know, we are based at Finchingfield in Essex. The estate has been owned since 1760 by the Ruggles-Bryce family. So they're getting to know the way around the place. Some of you may have heard of Archie Ruggles-Bryce. He's the co-owner and estate manager at the moment. He's got some gigs here today as well at 10 a.m. and at 1 p.m. if you want to catch him. Please ask lots of awkward questions. So the estate's quite large, but back in autumn 2022, we had the fortune of having 380 hectares of the land come back into hand from long-term tenancies. So this is where the project has started from. It's a very typical part of Essex countryside. There is nothing special about it. But what we are doing is something different. Archie saw that there was an opportunity with this land coming back in hand to start down a different path. Agroforestry is only part of our story at the moment on the estate. Today we are focusing on the nut production side and the biodiversity, but actually we're doing a whole host of other things. And one thing I always feel very strongly about is all of these things are intricately linked. Okay, so I never look at one thing in isolation, and that's a very big take-home message. So why not go back into a conventional arable enterprise? Well, the estate had no machinery. It had been long-term tenanted. So to start investing in machinery to start harvesting, particularly on what is actually quite marginal arable land, was really not a practically financially good decision. Particularly given climate change is upon us, you know, the sort of predictions of a 5-degree rise in temperature, 140 mil less on average rainfall. To us, that wasn't a good bet. Agroforestry isn't a new concept in Essex. For those that have been raking around the county for some time, you see it pretty much everywhere. Cricket-back willows, mainly in the river valleys associated with Essex in a big way. But what we've tried to do is bring this project and say, okay, we'll bring the agroforestry out into that conventional cropping land, the productive land, if you like. But we want to produce a low volume but high value crop, but with minimal environmental impact on that land going forward. So the system's been designed to produce a crop in synergy with the landscape scale nature recovery, but at the same time providing a range of income streams and capital investments to keep the estate sustainable and reduce that risk of, you know, all your nuts in one basket and all that kind of thing. So basically taking this forward, our farm products, if you like, are going to be nuts and nature. So we've split the talk into two halves, and Jamie Dixon is going to speak first about the nuts and bolts of setting up an agroforestry system. There you go. Okay.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So as you can see on the diagram just on here, this is an illustration of the design of our system. You can see from this, it's designed as a silver arable system. This is with large alleys, so it's 24-metre alleys. This is designed with in mind being able to use conventional and standard farming equipment, but then we've also obviously, as Sarah's already outlined, we're looking to create habitat strips and increase biodiversity with this land in particular. We have then the tree rows themselves. We have also either side of each tree row 4-metre spacings. This is to allow vehicle access and into the future mechanical harvesting of our nuts, which is quite important to us in terms of this design. You can also see a buffer strip around the edge of the fields. In addition to these tree rows and access, we've also got working areas in every single field, and also a track that runs between each tree row and just inside that buffer strip. These will allow access to the land for as much of the year as possible. Through development of a good strong sward, we'll be able to drive on this land, use machines on it without detrimentally impacting the areas that we're conducting habitat creation. So it kind of encourages that working together and kind of integrating both the biodiversity projects and the nuts together. In terms of field orientation, there's a number of different things you need to consider, but for us, we were particularly focused on field shape and making sure, again, we're designing these in order to improve access to the land. We also were making sure we can fit enough trees in to make sure, although on low density, we have got enough trees within field to be productive. We are also in certain areas having to adjust this thinking to make sure that we're considering soil erosion, slopes, also shelters for different species of trees. So unlike quite a lot of the agroforestry I've gone around before, where they've selected a particular orientation of their fields and stuck with it, we've got quite a lot of variety through the estate, and this is part of being able to working together for multiple functions on the estate does mean that we've had to adjust both systems to suit each other. So in terms of planning, the initial first stage, once we've kind of got that structure, so the agroforestry system gives the backbone to the estate and the structure for the rest of the projects going on, we're then looking at species selection. For us, we chose nut cropping. This is due to growing conditions, so we know that our lands can support walnut growth and hazel growth, so that was quite easy for us to kind of consider that. We're then also considering product handling and processing. So there was a few kind of bits of advice that we were thinking about fruit, soft fruits and things like that. But for us, nuts particularly, it's giving that bit more flexibility on being able to handle these products. And once processed, they're far easier and have far longer term storage options. And given the extent of the estate and the extent of the project, having that like storage option and not having everything all at once, and also slightly longer harvest periods is really a good thing for us. The next thing for us then on that planning like kind of flow chart is pollination. So these plants are wind pollinated. So cultivar selection becomes incredibly important, making sure that they're able to cross-pollinate each other and you have a good pollination window, making sure you're increasing productivity through pollination as much as possible. So including within that is then your wind direction. So you're looking at how these are then interacting with each other, making sure that you're getting best advantage from this orientation of your field to pollinate these trees. And then including within that is your percentages of pollinators. So we're searching for between 5 and 10%. On most of our fields, it's at that higher end. Cultivar selection for us allowed us to make sure that we're not wasting these trees. These aren't unproductive pollinator trees. There's 5 and 10% in field, but they are just making sure that each of the cultivars can interact pollination-wise and improve that productivity as much as possible. In terms of the planning as well, we are considering local climate. So within areas of the farm, we're looking for shelter for the walnuts. So wherever we're planting walnuts, we're trying to make sure they're in areas that are more sheltered. They are susceptible to wind damage a lot more than other trees. Equally, frost pockets and late frosts. In the UK, we do, particularly our areas, we're quite similar climate-wise and actually don't suffer from as severe winters. But the walnuts aren't too bothered by that. It's the late frost that's the real problem. And so putting these trees in frost pocket areas and lower areas isn't necessarily great. So we've kind of moved our system around and made sure we're putting hazels in certain areas and different species where suitable. And particularly nowadays with these different cultivars, you can make sure you're selecting later budding varieties to make sure you're not as susceptible to those issues. In terms of management, we're just looking particularly therefore at weeds, pests and watering, and there's various different things you can do about these issues, both longer term but in that planning stage and how you're designing your system. So moving on to the planting itself, got some pictures of the guys out in the field earlier in the season where the weather was a bit better and the ground wasn't quite so wet, but we'll cover things to consider, what we did and then the reasoning behind those decisions. So the major things to consider, again, when reverting back to cultivars. So this is one of the most important things, which is why I keep coming back to it. So each of these cultivars have great variability in how they're arriving to you. We had a lot of different things ourselves, but you're kind of thinking some suppliers will have different availabilities of different stock. It's depending on what countries you're coming from. They have different systems in their nurseries as to how they then ship their plants out and lift them. So you need to make sure these cultivars and your planting design and technique kind of suit multiple different and whatever supplier you've chosen. Suppliers wise and timing and everything else, it's very difficult to manage. And I'm sure many of you have had dealings with these kind of people, and they're very helpful and you can say all those things, but it never quite works how originally planned. They never quite arrive exactly when you had planned to, and they'll suddenly be on your doorstep either 3 weeks late or 2 weeks early, and you can never know which. And that's something you can just plan into your system. So make sure you're as flexible as possible. Make sure you're ready as early as possible. Timing wise as well, in terms of considering it, you want to be trying to get everything in as early in the season as possible. So again, I ended up being a bit of a pest to our suppliers and constantly trying to make sure I was on them and knew when our plants might be arriving. Technique wise, so you've got multiple options here, but you could be planting by machines. This could be ditching. This could be, I did have someone suggest me using a 360, but also a post-hole bore or something like that. You could be looking at using contractors for your planting, or you could engage the services of a big group of volunteers, or you could just do it all yourselves. And you make those decisions, and that can also impact on how you're planning the rest of your system. Guarding wise, this is going to be very farm specific and pressure specific. For us, we do have a lot of deer issues and deer pressures. So what you could be looking at, might want to fence a whole area off. You might fence each individual row. You might be using big metal guards. You might be using just your standard plastic tree guards. It's kind of, once you've made that decision though, will really impact on how you're accessing your trees long term and how you're managing them into the future. So this is what we actually did. So this is actually phase 2. So this is this year's planting, where we'd already learned all the stupid mistakes that we did the first time round. So we chose to hand plant everything with a small team internally. We also moved materials and by hand quite a lot, because again, this year particularly, weather conditions and ground conditions were quite awful. So we didn't want to cause any damage to the ground that we're intending to turn into travelling working areas in the future. In that first year, we've got quite a lot of bare ground. We don't want to be ruining it to then not be able to manage it well in the future. We can also see here, we've put in 6 foot 3-inch posts on every guard. We put them in first. This was a lesson we learnt, which I'll cover slightly in a minute, but these also acted as a way of marking where each tree was going. So when we got to the point of planting, we just whacked them all in without having to plot them as we went. You can also see, just about make out on one of the pictures there, you've got little vole guards at the base. These biodegradable guards designed mainly to protect the stem from mulch that we're putting down. We are mulching the base, and we've got weld mesh guards around each tree with a Hessian biodegradable tree tie on each one, especially on the taller walnuts to stop whipping and damage. We've doubled these up so they do kind of retain the tree quite well. And then we've got a hazel pole in the top, and that is to stop birds landing on top of the trees and snapping the leader out, which is a very important thing to consider. There are people who lose quite a few trees that way. So this covers the reasons why. So again, with the mix of suppliers and where they're coming from and when they're coming, the flexibility allowed to us by just doing it ourselves. We're a small team, knew exactly what we're doing, had a lot of control. When we could plant, we were planting. When the weather conditions didn't allow, we didn't. We hadn't set ourselves to using machines, so we then weren't then sat there with a machine all through this winter where we couldn't get on any ground with no other backup. So that's the reason we selected that. We also were covering a lot of large area of bare ground. And so with newly established seed mixes and habitats, and so again, like moving around the estate was quite restrictive. And that's one of the reasons we also didn't move to contractors or volunteers, because that control where we knew where we could go and when we could go was quite important to us. As covered a little bit, is unpredictable weather. So first year, actually, we did get machines on. The weather was very dry. It was absolutely perfect. It was a lovely time. There was probably a brief period in there where it was too cold and hard frost where we weren't planting. Most of the time it was great. But then we hit spring and we were watering in February. It was so dry, it was absolutely awful. Almost entirely opposite this year. So it was incredibly wet all through. We had quite a lot of regular odd days that we couldn't plant at all, waterlogged fields, but we've had quite a good spring as far as tree establishment is concerned. As the trees were in as early as possible, they were already in when the water was coming through early spring. So it's being flexible again allowed us to deal with both of those options. And if you're planning this a year or two in advance, you know, it's quite good to have that flexibility inbuilt. These are the trees. These are the walnuts. So quite a lot of these are quite large. They're quite large root stocks as well. They're all grafted. The hazels we received, particularly some of the ones from Italy, some of them were potted, some of them were heavily root pruned and stem pruned, and were very small trees, and then had wax dips as well. So very different trees coming in, all being planted by the same people at the same time. So again, a small team, a lot of control, kind of knowledge of how we want it done was the best way for us to do it. Maintenance. So now I'm going to cover the first year and what we did wrong, and then what we learnt from it. So this is an Agroforestry trailer. So this is how we're mulching the trees at the moment. We've established the sward on these areas, these running tracks. So now we can run vehicles up and down it, regular maintenance. So it makes the job a lot easier. We're mechanising as much as we can now. But by having established this sward early on, this means these tractors aren't damaging the ground as we're going along at this point. So year one, run the tractors on there. We did the whole thing all at once, mulching, guarding, planting, everything all at once. We also put in 60 centimetre tubex guards on the base of these trees, again for the protection from the mulch, and thought it was a good idea to do with stuff we had lying around. We repeated tree line cutting to establish the sward for the second year of planting. We watered everything with a water bowser, not advisable, but cover that in a second. And we're pruning in June. This is to encourage leader growth as much as possible and reduce side shoot growth. So the lessons learned, this is one of the examples of what we put in the first year. Standard tree stakes, bit too flimsy. The mulch and guarding and putting hazel pole in all at once, far too time consuming. First year we were talking 700 hazel and walnut plants. Second year with 4,200. So if we tried to do what we did the first year and second year, we'd probably still be there. The 60 centimetre guard, as it turned out, was also a bit of a mistake. It encouraged so much growth within that guard, creating a microclimate, that we're losing a lot of the energy of the tree into there. We heavily pruned it off, but in future we didn't do that. Going forward, we just put those little 20 centimetre volt guards. We haven't had the same issue. This is a particular problem when it comes to the grafted walnuts, because there was shoots coming out below graft point. So if you're not picking up that quickly, you can end up with a tree that's not actually what you wanted in the first place. We also found these guards encouraged deer interest. So actually the bucks particularly came and started playing with them because they make a nice feeling and a nice noise. And this is why we've ended up with these 6-foot posts. And the other advantage of these posts, which we put in now, is we're now managing all of these tree lines with a barrier mower, so they can run up and down these smaller trees and manage these weeds quite happily and cut these lines, whereas with the standard tree guards and stakes, we wouldn't necessarily have been able to do that. So longer term, just as the last bit, so we're going to continue mulching. This is both in terms of our main source of weed suppression around the trees to reduce competition. Also, we have found on the trees that we did a lot of this on last year, and there was a couple of areas that we couldn't get too much. There is a big difference in growth, and that's due to moisture retention in the soil particularly. We are also researching at the moment and developing an alternate watering system. So we are monitoring moisture in the ground, and boughs are, really labour intensive, not ideal for running up and down these tree lines long term. So we are developing that, and thankfully there's a few companies out here that are potentially going to help us with that as well, which is good. Continued pruning, so we're pruning twice a year. So June prune is something like very common, particularly with walnuts in Bulgaria and Turkey. You know, making sure that we're mechanically harvesting, so we need nice long tall leaders and a nice bare stem at the base. So we're pushing those leaders up by pruning regularly. Deer and squirrel control, we already shoot deer on the estate and produce venison. We're going to continue this, and we've done trials within our semi-natural ancient woodland of squirrel trapping, and we're going to be making sure we do that at specific times of the year to try and keep on top of those. It's going to be very important to us. This is a quite interesting for us, is managing each tree individually. So this is quite a low density system. It's very important to make sure these trees are as productive as possible. We're not going to be managing by field. We're not going to be managing by cultivar or species. This is going to be literally by tree. Each tree is individually mapped in GIS. Each tree is going to have, and does in some cases, have details on them. So we'll take observations as we're walking the estate. We can write that per tree and kind of observe actions taken. And then longer term, we can monitor harvest production. So we'll be mechanically shaking, collecting rather than sweeping, because that suits the estate and the system. But that means that we can actually monitor each tree as we go along and ensure we're keeping a good production curve. And once very long term, we're starting to reduce that production, we can then make decisions at the right time in terms of replacement or removal. And this is quite important to us. We don't want any kind of waste trees or waste ground within the tree lines, because as I say, quite a low density system, so we need to remain as productive as possible. And I'll pass you back over to Sarah for now.
Thanks, Jamie. So when Archie first said to me he wanted to put in an agroforestry system across arable land, this is what I pictured. And I can tell you it wasn't positive. Swapping one monoculture for another, not really my bag as an ecologist. So I thought we'd try and do things a little bit differently, which suited Archie's ethos completely. So the ecological landscape plan came about after a few months of lockdowns, etc. And the main thing to say about this is that the design was completed before it was costed, before we started slotting in funding and schemes. Whilst we had different schemes in mind, that wasn't the primary, it wasn't the main reason that we were doing this initially. So what we did was we looked at each individual piece of land and said, okay, what is the priority on those areas? So we were informed by the land, things like, you know, the soil type, the topography, the priority species, any habitats next to those areas of field, all of those factors, any data that we could get hold of, that was what we used to inform this design. So a very important thing to say first. So like any crop production, the new system requires economies of scale. And so a decision was made on a field by field basis. So for any farmers here, you will straight away go, okay, well, we remove the edge of the field, awkward land, short land, wet land, shaded land, basically all the land that has a poor crop delivery. So you can see at the top of the picture here, within this group of 5 fields, we actually only had one field that's gone into agroforestry. So that one on the top left-hand side, the reasonably large square field, it was a good shape. We could get some good long, consistent rows for the agroforestry system in without having to constantly turn, etc. So it makes it viable. The other fields were all either awkward, they had poor access, or things like the field at the front of the screen. You can see it's got a crop in there, but at the base of that, bottom of that crop next to the wood, it's pretty poor. There's a huge amount of runoff. Soil erosion came down that field every year, despite that very gentle slope, straight into a designated woodland, straight into the watercourse. It also has a Roman villa just a few feet under the surface in that field. So 2 very, very good reasons not to plant nuts, but actually to do the right thing by the land as a whole. So in reality, the bottom half of that field has gone into a grass buffer and a successional area, which will complement the woodland in terms of biodiversity, and it will soak up the water. The rest of it has gone into a permanent flower meadow, and that will protect the Roman villa long term. So our heritage for the next few generations. The little field in the middle there, small, wet, unproductive. I've been trying for 2 years now to get a crop in there and grow it, and I have failed every time. It's too wet, it's too weedy, all these things, despite copious amounts of Roundup. And it's also got a lot of deer. So whilst we control deer on the estate, the woodlands are in good condition. They've been managed by the family for quite a lot of decades now. We've got a very good shrub layer, understory, etc., because of deer control, because of the thinning, coppicing management, etc. But we still do have a significant number of deer, as all of Essex and much of the country has. So we are fighting that all the time. Putting agroforestry into that field is just simply not practical. But also we've got all of these very good ancient semi-natural woodland blocks, and they're all slightly disconnected. But we do have some very large blocks, which is unusual for the Essex landscape when you look at it from a wider estate perspective. So what we thought we would do is join those up. So this is good ecology. Connectivity is the basis. How an animal gets from A to B, how it utilises that habitat is fundamental. So by planting woodland in that small field, we're actually going to be connecting those habitats. This is really important for things like marsh tits. They have a very fragmented population within Essex and actually much of the country now. They're isolated in woodlands because they don't readily disperse over open ground very far. And as a result of that, they therefore stick with that woodland. But they have very large territories. They're a 9-gram bird, but they have territories of sort of 6 to 10 hectares, sometimes more. Which means you can only actually fit into the biggest woodland that we have on the estate, about 3 to 4 territories. And therefore, you're very limited with that population. So the priority in these fields was actually the biodiversity. It was actually saying, let's try and increase a rare bird. Let's do the biodiversity bit in that field rather than the agroforestry. So looking at the other side of the wood, classic old muddy farm track right around the edge of the field, product of subsidy systems. And frankly, that track is so rutted and wet, even in June, you could lose small children in it. And actually, when you're looking at nut harvests in the future, you're looking at a late harvest. And we certainly don't want to be creating massive rutted, muddy tracks on quite heavy clay land at a time of year when we're doing harvest. So one of the key things was designing in infrastructure to be able to access the crop. So taking that muddy track out into the field where it can dry off, it's sunny, putting it in structurally sound next to the crop was, to me, quite a big priority. But it also then allows you to say, okay, the bit between the track and the wood, that was shaded. So the measurements that were the reason it's there is because it was shaded. You don't want a crop growing in that shady area. The habitat around that wood was already developing. There's some nice sedges, etc. It's very, very wet. When I was walking around mapping these wet areas that were wheat, or they were trying to be wheat, I thought, well, this would be fantastic as a pond. Looking at natural, what the land naturally wants to be, what it's trying to be, is so much more important. Because otherwise you're just fighting nature all the time. So we're going with it. So we're having ponds. That whole area has become a successional area which will complement the woodland long term and also buffer that woodland. There's a few veteran trees on the edge in those hedgerows. We don't have many on the estate, so that what we do have I want to keep because they're hugely biodiverse features. So when you look at all of this, you just basically say, okay, we will farm the productive areas, take out those edges, so that things like the veteran trees, their root balls then are not disturbed anymore. So when you go further around, you can say here, okay, well, we've got this small field. It's between 2 woodlands. It's shaded, a lot of deer presence. And whilst it's nice and square, it would be great for forestry rows. In actual case, it is such a poor field. I've struggled for the last 6 years to grow a herbal lay on it, never mind anything else. So when we looked at the 16-18 map that we're very fortunate to have on the estate, that field was actually woodland. This worked very well. The field's small, isolated, agriculturally poor, and also not great in terms of size. So we used historic maps quite a lot within this design, with the 1618 map and then going forward with all the more recent maps. So there was a lot of common sense in those old maps. Things like hedgerows that were present often served a very good purpose, that since they've been removed, we've then realised what their function was. Just as a slight aside, the picture in the middle is the 1618 map overlaid by a Google Earth image, and it's almost exactly a fit, which I think is incredible for cartographers 400 years ago to be able to fit that so precisely. So hats off to them. We do have quite a strong historic landscape across the estate. We have Spain's Hall itself, or whilst it's in different ownership now with Jamie Oliver, he has the land around the hall, and that's registered as BAT priority wood pasture and parkland. This is quite a rare habitat now in Essex and indeed across the country, and it's very fragmented. Most of it I see is in poor condition, or under arable farming. So it's something that we want to be able to increase as an ecologist. What we've done is we've taken the small, unproductive, awkward fields that of a historic nature all the way around Spain's Hall, and actually all the estate buildings. There's quite a lot of estate buildings within that vicinity that are all listed, and said, okay, let's actually use the historic landscape to expand that wood pasture and parkland. And frankly, I don't think it's right to put a crop system right next to these historic views. I think it's nice to try and retain those. And it works for us. We got balance, we've got connectivity, we're expanding a rare habitat, and we're not agroforestrying everything. Here you've got, at the top, you've got a wood, you've got that successional area I was talking about earlier on. But down at the bottom, you've got two blocks essentially in two separate fields at the moment that are going into wood pasture and parkland as part of that area expansion. Whilst I take history quite seriously in the landscape because it tells you so much, you shouldn't be a slave to it. And it's putting things back, but also making appropriate changes. So this area will become one area of wood pasture. At the moment, it's in two separate fields. But the reason is that we've got historic ponds around there. I've got historic buildings. It made sense from that perspective. But also taking the agroforestry rows down that field made more sense in terms of production. When taking them across, it just didn't work. But it left me with that quite big block of awkward shortland at the bottom. So it made sense to say, well, what else could we do with that rather than it go to waste? So it's careful design with the crop production and the habitat creation sort of merging together. Always got to continue when you make these decisions to think about the whole landscape. You've got the wood at the top, you've got a clean water coming down that side ditch along that really nice ancient hedge that feeds those historic ponds. So you absolutely want to retain that, but that wood pasture and that hedge then connects into the woodland. So it's all very connected through the wider landscape for things like bats, for example. Here, this field originally was 60 hectares, which by my sort of reckoning is a bit too big for ecology. What we've done is we've taken some of those historic hedgerows on the maps and we've put some of the more practical ones back. So we've split it into several fields again. But that allowed us also to look at the orientation of the agroforestry. So this bit slopes quite steeply down in places to the river valley. There was no way I was going to put agroforestry going down the slope. I was going to always put it across the slope because we had quite serious soil erosion issues when it was been farmed conventionally. So that putting in those hedgerows, whilst it also connected up the landscape, excuse me, in terms of ecology, but what also did was then break up that field and allow us to orientate the agroforestry areas and blocks, and also provide additional shelter and start to create some microclimates. This is a very high exposed part of the estate. So as Jamie said earlier, we want to try and minimise things like frost pockets, etc., exposed areas. But on the slopes going down to the river, there was no way that I felt that it was appropriate to put agroforestry again. For one thing, it'd be really difficult for Jamie and his team to manage on those steep slopes. The ground is very poor, it's very drought prone. So I saw that instead as an opportunity. Because it's all ex-arable land, I'm never going to be able to create the wildflower meadows that I waft through in Yorkshire. It's not going to happen because there's a nutrient imbalance there from long-term farming. But what I can do is say, okay, I've got a slope, it's steep, it's gravelly, there's not much soil left at the top. It's quite sunny and dry. Therefore, that gives me an opportunity to be able to sow and create some wildflower areas that will be a little bit more using native species and be a bit more diverse. But when you do that, you've got to also think, well, how are you going to manage that long term? And if you create a meadow in isolation, it's never going to get managed. Jamie's just going to go, no, we haven't got time for that, Sarah. We'll do the big stuff first. So it had to be part of a bigger unit. So what we've done is we've taken the whole river valley and we've created that grazing unit right the way through. Excuse me. Right the way through. And we will manage that grazing unit with different habitats, with things like a no fence system, etc. But you've got to think big. I don't want to be carting stock from one place to another every 5 minutes with the trailer. It's got to work fluidly right the way through. So within the between the tree rows, we call them alleys. Each of these alleys is a different habitat. So there is replication. We've used the standard schemes to do this, partly for income, but also partly for ease of management. We're a small team. It's not practical to have huge numbers of bespoke mixes in every single plot. But what I wanted to do was to get that variety in. We need year-round farmland habitat. We don't want to be messing about with just providing, really good nesting, but no brood rearing or no winter shelter or food. Has to be the whole thing as far as I'm concerned. Otherwise, you're not doing your job as an ecologist. So rather than creating lots of variety with very bespoke areas, what we're doing is creating variety within the standard options for different schemes. This one is countryside stewardship. And the winter bird cover option, which a lot of you will be familiar with. But all of those pictures are taken of the same crop, but they're all very different. We've got perennial crops, we've got biannual crops, we've got annual crops. So they've all got different species in, different structures, different heights, and you've got different times of year where they all are doing something slightly different. So you have diversity of structure and species, and that's really, really important, because then there's always something for everything. So if you take a skylark, for example, they can nest from early April right through to September in a wet year, and they can potentially have 4 broods. They need open ground for nesting initially, right the way through the summer. They need brood rearing habitats, so insect rich areas. They also need winter shelter, and they need winter food. All of those things have to be provided, but it has to be provided all year round, right through these seasons. So this shows very clearly that you can have that even though you're on arable land in a standard scheme. When you look at some of the other alleys, we've put in things like the autumn bumblebird mix, which does exactly what it says. We've also got fallow areas for that open nesting. It's habitat for, heaven for skylarks. Most farmers look at it and go, oh my God, it's a mess. But those weeds are great for invertebrates, and therefore they're eaten by things like the birds. So that the whole ecosystem is present. And we're trying to rotate. So I'm trying to work out a system of sort of nutrient cycling. So where we've got legume mixes, for example, fixing nitrogen in the short term, because they're agricultural species, they will, start to diminish as time goes by. And then I will replace those with a thirsty winter bird food cover with kale, for example, which feeds a very good variety of songbirds on the estate, but also it allows us to sort of cycle those nutrients. So that's what I'm trying to do with minimum inputs. Oh, no, hang on, I'm going back again. So I think one of the reasons that we've used standard options is because they are available financially, but actually also the research is there that shows that they work. And I think that, that's an important thing to remember. Whilst it doesn't look particularly exciting or particularly natural in many ways, these things do work very, very well. So I think the last thing to say is that the management of these is the variety is created by different crops, different times of year. So, things like we're cultivating at different times, that minimises weed burden, different depths, etc. But fundamentally, it has to be practically manageable on scale, because otherwise we won't actually achieve what we need to, because we're too busy, panicking, frankly. And I don't want to give Jamie any more work than I need to. So the last thing is from Jamie and myself is really to say, if there's anyone out there who is interested in working with us to look at how these alleys and the habitats that we're creating can integrate with the nut crop in terms of sort of companion planting, pests and diseases, and how that would work together, we'd be really interested. We are at the start of this project, and it's a little bit of an experiment, but it would be really good to hear from someone that could help us understand that relationship and maybe tailor further what we do have here already as a starting point. So feel free to ask questions. Our outside team are here. I'm very proud to say, I'm going to embarrass them completely now, we are a farm of 4 women out of 7 in the team. Yeah, go the girls. So, any questions for anyone? Oh, crikey. Yes, sir. Yep. Oh, sorry, got to wait for the mic.
I was just going to ask Jamie how big a crop he's envisioning on getting with these nuts, and how he's intending to market it. Are you going to sell it direct to the public? Are you going to use wholesalers? Obviously, Jamie Oliver up at the hall can have a few, but
yeah, hopefully so. So we're obviously at the beginning part of this kind of planting process. We've deliberately selected, again, back onto the kind of selection of species and cultivars, we've deliberately selected quite versatile stock. We have no intention at this point to, although we do want to make the thing of, English walnuts as opposed to imported, we're not going for that kind of, bespoke high brand. Like, this is going to be at scale, and therefore we're marketing products. Initially, in that first few years, we will have a bit of kind of, with the walnuts, we're looking at 5 years further on, before we're getting any kind of, decent crop for anything. And so during that period, we will be direct selling and then trying to make a name. And then from there, we're investigating as we speak, so we haven't found it yet, of where we're marketing to a more broad scale and wholesale market wise, and products and processing that we're intending to do on the estate itself. In terms of per tree, within that kind of, you speak to different people, you speak to different consultants, you'll get very different numbers, but we're kind of aiming around that 8 kilo per tree in that first 5 to 10 year period, and that growing from there onwards.
Okay, should we have someone right at the back there? Let's get the chap
moving,
exercising. Getting your steps in for the day.
Hello. Could you talk a bit more about the trials and errors you've been on with the natural pest management and your companion planting in the rotations?
Not really. That's what I want help with. What I can tell you is I was in ecological research for quite a few years, and I did lots of sweep netting and devacking and sampling of insects in all these different habitats. So I've been very careful to try and include species and plants that I know produce beneficial insects in abundance and diversity. So that's kind of the limit of my knowledge. How that interacts with the tree rows, that's the bit I want some help with specifically, if anyone's up for that. Anyone else? Should we come to the front? You get your steps right up then, won't you?
Thank you. Really interesting. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about establishment costs and a little bit about whether you're organic. You did mention glyphosate on a field, but it sounds like you're down the organic route.
Both of us can
Yeah, I
answer
think
this separately, can't we?
Yeah. So the glyphosate bit, when I started working full time on the estate as the ecologist, which is a new thing for an estate, Archie was really laughing at me a lot because the first thing I did was came in and sprayed everything with glyphosate, which he didn't think was very ecological. But the reality is that we're on ex-arable land. A lot of it's heavy land, and it comes with a weed burden from, poor rotation over many decades. So I wanted to start with a clean sheet, if you like, and minimal creeping thistles, etc. So that's why we've used glyphosate initially. The intention now is going forward to minimise the use of chemicals and allow the natural pest management and the establishment of good quality habitats to come to the forefront. In terms of costs?
Also adding to that as well is we have at the moment no intention of organic. It's low input, but we don't want to kind of stable ourselves off and not be able to adjust our management going forward. It's something we may revisit, but in terms of the trees themselves, we are low input. We have selected, again, with walnuts particularly, they're fairly good at disease, thinking of the word, resilience. But we are low input rather than kind of market ourselves organic. In terms of costings, we did have help funding from certain bodies. We had a very helpful local council, so Essex County Council with their tree fund. But per tree, including costs of planting, we worked this out about £30 per tree. So that's guarding, obviously, the plant itself, and then the costings of time of putting them in the first place. Obviously, beyond that, there is additional costs, which I've got spreadsheets of times and things that and we'll gradually make sure we've got data on, because this is how we're reporting to ourselves more than anything, on how much time we're spending effectively per tree in this first couple of years of management, which is going to be quite intensive. This chap just behind him there. Sorry, sir. He had his hand up every single time.
Is that working? Yeah. How many different varieties of cob and walnut are you?
So we've effectively, with the hazel, we've ended up with 4 different varieties, mainly making sure, again, with versatility, but into pollination is the main consideration for that. And the number of cultivars there also means that you've got the longer pollination period and matching up of flowering of the different cultivars, also kind of spreading that kind of little bit of risk, because some of the different varieties do have slightly different characteristics and resiliences. And we're very similar, so we do actually have 6 different varieties of walnut, but we've concentrated on 2 main productive ones, 2 main pollinators, and then a couple of extras which we had particularly in the first year that was just to do with availability.
I do have some experience on growing cobs and walnuts, so I'll talk to you about pests.
Oh, brilliant, yeah.
Go on then, Julie.
Is this on? Hello, it's Julie
Yes.
from Fwaggies. We love what you're doing, and it's lovely to see how much thought has gone into everything, and it's been a lot of hard work, I know. My question was, are you sequestering carbon from the agroforestry, or have you got any plans to generate carbon credits?
Not particularly at the moment, no.
So in terms of studies on the estate, so Archie has been involved with, this is more his bag, frankly, but he has been involved with some studies on the agroforestry in terms of sequestering carbon, but to do with the tree densities that we've got, it's just it doesn't quite add up value-wise, but certainly in terms of that, it is something he's still looking at, and carbon is something that's still within the kind of business plan and management in the future. It's just not quite there. I worked out how that fits in yet.
Wondered if you're growing your own mulch for the trees.
So we haven't got any specific areas at the moment that's set up for growing mulch. We have, because of the general management plan we've got with the woodlands, and also with some of the other areas we've had to remove trees anyway as part of ponds and everything else. A lot of that is going straight into mulch creation for the estate, and we also generated quite a lot of compost gradually, that we're actually chatting to some of the guys over at Bakashi and things about what we can do with that longer term as well, which will then go back into the mulching kind of system.
It's probably worth saying, actually, Julie works with FWAG. She won't mind me saying they've been helping us with the district licensing scheme, restoring ponds across the estate. And we're doing a ghost pond next week, which is very exciting, which will be connected up with our new hedgerows and habitats, etc. So, yeah, it's all go. Anyone else? Oh, we'll have one over here.
Thank you. I too have been trying to establish trees on my farm, and you're mentioning that you're ex-arable and that it's awkward soil to establish trees. Have you done anything about remediation, trying to get increased fungal levels in your soils to promote faster growth? I've found with my hazels they're just ridiculously slow to establish and are taking a long time.
Yeah, so this is something I could have, if I had a bit more time on that presentation for us, it's one of the things could have covered in these lessons kind of learned is that at the time of planting, we were kind of in this little kind of bubble of, right, get them all in, and we had actually conversations just previously about kind of dips and things like that, and kind of trying to establish, and equally something I definitely would consider, it's something I've seen quite a lot in Europe as well, is companion or nursery planting of different trees, that they're pioneer species that really help with that. Where we didn't do that was, again, because of where we were trying to plant these systems in the first place, and also where we were trying to make sure we can mechanically manage them. We were worried about, with different schemes potentially going on, that we would plant these companion trees in and we'd kind of be stuck with them. And then causes a massive problem into the future. I know in certain, I was chatting to some people who'd done exactly this system in Czech Republic, where in fact they had to establish 100 trees per hectare in order to get their grant for planting, but then they're free to do almost anything they like with them after it. So they've designed it so they then are periodically removing each tree to end up with a standalone nut tree to then be able to mechanically harvest, which is brilliant, but it doesn't really necessarily fulfill the functions that people would want in terms of tree density planting. So we haven't, and it's something I kind of regret already. But it's, in terms of our hazels, we did on our first, obviously the major lot we planted this year have started growing and doing okay, but can't see much. But the ones last year, they looked like they could have been a disaster, particularly of the weather we had as soon as we planted them. They were quite planted relatively late as far as when we wanted to. And then we obviously had a horrible February. But they've suddenly, and thought some of them had real keeled over, but they've come alive this year, and they've really started to go great guns, particularly ones in the lower parts of the of the valley.
I think we've got time for one more question. There's a gentleman behind there. He was first, I think.
Thank you. 2 questions. 4,000 trees, what machinery are you using to mulch? Because that sounds like a big job. Second question, how are you working your kind of cash flow out for the next 5 years before you make 10 pounds of nuts per tree or 5 kgs of nuts per tree? Because that sounds like a big cash gap.
Brilliant. We'll divide the answer up as the question is divided as well. So in terms of the mulch and trees, so I did have a quick picture which I might gloss over slightly. We've got called an Agroforestry trailer, which is designed for vineyards, but it's basically it's a side discharge spreader effectively, and we've managed, because it's a narrow gauge trailer, we're able to offset it slightly on the tractor. Which means we can do low speeds on the PTO and kind of relatively delicately put this mulch straight down on the trees without blasting them to oblivion. And this is equally, some of the cages themselves and the little vol guards are very helpful actually when you watch it happen, that it does protect that stem and make sure it kind of spreads. It does require a bit of handling afterwards, and a little bit of pushing around and make sure it's spread more evenly. But as long as in the future we carry on quite regularly, that won't be as much of a factor once we've got a nice bed of mulch based in there. So that's how we're mulching, at least.
So in terms of the income streams, we're trying to divide and conquer. So we are in lots of schemes, so countryside stewardship, English wood and creation offer, higher tier woodland management, but we're also just struck a biodiversity net gain deal. So we're sort of apportioning up different areas of the estate and going into different schemes, and that will give us both short and long-term income. So yeah, that's how we're trying to achieve the finances and cash flow to keep it all smoothly running. I think that's all, folks, isn't it?
Brilliant.
Yeah.